The coffee in my thermos was still steaming, but it didn't smell like roasted beans anymore. It smelled like the burned circuit board of the laptop Miller just smashed, and the copper tang of the blood leaking from his nose onto my carpet. 10 minutes ago, I was a sister. Now, I'm an insurance payout. I just found the ledger. My parents' fatal car crash, listed as a strategic asset liquidation. My brother Leo's drowning, a tax-efficient reorganization. My name is Sarah Sterling, and according to the 11 p.m. deadline on Arthur's silenced pistol, my life is currently pending deletion. Arthur was the only man I ever trusted, and he just told me my family was murdered for gambling debts. I have 40 minutes to upload the truth before the power is cut, and they find me in this panic room. I can hear the fire axe splintering the door behind me. Let me take you back to where this began. The cursor flickered against a sea of emerald cells, a rhythmic pulse that felt like a ticking clock in the silence of the room. Sarah Sterling's neck craned forward, the blue light of the monitor etching deep shadows into her tired features and reflecting off the thin wire frames of her glasses. She toggled the macro, watching the maintenance costs column dissolve into a string of hexadecimal codes. A final keystroke stripped the protection bare, peeling back the layers of corporate deception she had spent months unpicking. Names replaced the serial numbers. Dates aligned with the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty house. Beside her brother Leo's name, the ledger listed a payout for a faulty brake line under the cold heading of operational optimization. Her parents, Robert and Margaret, occupied a row titled liability liquidation. The hum of the cooling fan grew deafening, vibrating through the mahogany desk and into her fingertips like a physical warning. A bitter taste of copper flooded her mouth, the metallic tang of adrenaline and grief. She stared at the numbers, her mind performing the grim math. Every cent spent on the accidents was accounted for, balanced against the projected insurance payouts and the saved dividends. It was a perfect loop of profit and loss where human lives were merely rounding errors. The Sterling ledger, her personal notebook of truth, sat open beside the keyboard. She recorded the time, 2:14 a.m. The discrepancy was no longer a theory. It was a verified constant. The family business, Efficiency Logistics, wasn't just a shipping giant. It was a factory that manufactured tragedies for a return on investment. The floorboard in the hallway groaned. A sharp, wooden snap that cut through the electrical hum. Sarah reached for a flash drive, her pulse thumping against her collarbone like a trapped bird. Her fingers shook as she initiated the copy, the progress bar crawling with agonizing indifference. She grabbed her heavy legal briefcase, the leather cold and stiff, and prepared to move. The numbers never lie, do they, Sarah? Julian's voice drifted through the cracked door, smooth and devoid of heat, like a blade sliding through silk. He stepped into the room, his tailored Italian suit smelling of expensive cedar and the damp, metallic scent of rain. He checked his gold Rolex, tapping the glass 3 times, a rhythmic tick that signaled his growing agitation. Miller followed, a shadow filling the doorway. The head of security stood with his arms crossed, his knuckles scarred and white, the jagged scar through his eyebrow twitching in the dim light. "You turned them into a tax write-off," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She gripped the edge of the screen, knuckles aching. "Leo, Mom, Dad, they weren't people to you. They were just overhead." Julian sighed, adjusting his cufflinks with a practiced, elegant motion. "Inefficiency breeds rot, Sarah. You of all people should understand the necessity of a clean balance sheet. We pruned the branch to save the tree. It's about the long-term health of the legacy." Miller lunged without a word, his movement a blur of predatory efficiency. Sarah didn't think. She reacted. She swung her heavy desk lamp, the metal base clipping Miller's temple with a sickening thud. Glass shattered, spraying diamonds across the dark carpet. As Miller stumbled, Sarah grabbed her briefcase and shoved it with all her might into his knees. He went down with a grunt of surprised pain. She scrambled over her swivel chair, lungs burning, as Julian's fingers clamped around her throat. The smell of his cologne, something sharp and citrusy, choked her. She clawed at his eyes, her heels drumming a frantic rhythm against the hardwood. The ledger glowed behind them, a digital tombstone illuminating their struggle. With a desperate surge of strength, she drove her elbow into Julian's ribs, hearing the air hiss out of him. She bolted for the door, the flash drive clutched in her hand like a talisman, and sprinted toward the stairs. The descent was a blur of shadows and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She could hear Julian behind her, his voice echoing in the stairwell as he began to count out loud. 1, 2, 3. The rhythmic chanting sent a chill down her spine. It was the sound of a man who had turned his madness into a system. She burst through the heavy oak doors of the estate and into the freezing night air. The rain was a cold needle prick against her skin as she scrambled into her car. Her hands fumbled with the ignition, the engine turning over with a reluctant growl before roaring to life. She didn't look back at the looming silhouette of the Sterling mansion. She had the data. She had the proof. Now, she needed the only person she still trusted to help her weigh the cost of the truth. The local diner was a sanctuary of flickering neon and the smell of burnt coffee. It was 3:45 a.m., and the only other patron was a tired waitress who refused to look at the red booths, her eyes fixed on the floor. Sarah sat in the corner, her back to the wall, watching the door. The bell chimed, and Arthur Pendergast stepped inside. He looked every bit the elder statesman of the accounting world, his fringe of white hair neat, his face like crumpled parchment. The sharp, medicinal scent of a peppermint lozenge preceded him, a smell Sarah had associated with safety since she was a child. "Sarah, dear," Arthur said, his voice a soothing baritone. He sat across from her and placed a small silver tin on the table. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I've seen the ledger, Arthur," Sarah said, sliding her laptop across the Formica tabletop. "The real one. The one Julian tried to hide in the maintenance subdirectories. It's all there. The brake lines, the accidental drowning. They even calculated the tax break on the funeral costs." She felt a wave of relief wash over her as Arthur adjusted his glasses and began to scroll. Arthur had been her father's partner for 40 years. He had taught her how to balance a checkbook when she was 7. He was the one who had encouraged her obsession with the math, telling her that while people were fickle, the numbers were a divine constant. With Arthur's testimony and this data, she could dismantle efficiency logistics and put Julian in a cage for the rest of his life. Arthur's eyes moved rhythmically across the screen. He popped a peppermint into his mouth, the crunch of the candy loud in the quiet diner. Sarah watched his face, waiting for the shock, the outrage, the grief. She expected him to take her hand and tell her they would go to the authorities together. She imagined the weight of the Sterling legacy finally lifting off her shoulders. "It's remarkable work, Sarah," Arthur whispered, his eyes never leaving the emerald cells. "The way you traced the offshore routing through the secondary insurance providers, most forensic auditors would have missed the 3-cent rounding error that flagged the payout. I knew you'd see it," Sarah said, her shoulders finally dropping an inch. "We have him, Arthur. We can end this tonight." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were unblinking, as cold and gray as a winter Atlantic. He didn't look like a grandfather. He looked like an auditor who had just found a terminal deficit. "The problem, Sarah, is that you've only looked at the how," Arthur said softly. He reached into his heavy wool coat. "You never stopped to ask who taught Julian how to hide the why." The relief Sarah had felt turned into a leaden weight in her stomach. She watched as Arthur's hand emerged from his coat, but he wasn't holding a phone or a pen. He was holding a small black pistol, the barrel fitted with a long, heavy cylinder. "The fiscal quarter ends tonight, Sarah," Arthur said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "And your account is tragically overdrawn. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, a sudden loss of oxygen that made the room tilt. Arthur wasn't her protector. He was the architect. He was the one who had turned the Sterling family into a series of strategic liquidations. Every lesson he had taught her about the truth of math had been a way to groom her, to see if she was strong enough to join the firm, or if she would eventually become another line item to be erased. You killed them," she stammered, her eyes darting to the door. "I optimized the assets," Arthur corrected. He checked his watch. "Julian is a blunt instrument, but he follows instructions. You, however, have always been an unpredictable variable. And in my business, variables are a liability." The realization was a cold shiver. The diner, the rain, the flickering lights, it was all part of a closing ceremony. She looked at the peppermint tin on the table. The smell of menthol was no longer the scent of a hospital. It was the smell of the morgue. Sarah didn't wait for him to pull the trigger. She reached for the heavy industrial coffee urn at the end of the booth, her fingers searing as they gripped the metal handle. With a scream of pure, panicked defiance, she upended the boiling liquid toward Arthur. A cloud of white steam erupted, thick and scalding. Arthur cried out, the silenced pistol discharged a soft thwip that shattered a sugar shaker on the table instead of her chest. The smell of wet wool and burnt sugar filled the air. Sarah didn't look back. She grabbed her laptop and bolted through the kitchen, the heat of the steam still stinging her face. She burst through the back exit into the alleyway, the rain now a torrential downpour that turned the world into a gray smudge. Her lungs ached as she sprinted toward the perimeter fence. The chain link bit into her palms as she scrambled upward, her boots slipping on the wet metal. Halfway over, her smartphone caught on a snag in her pocket. She felt it slide out, falling into the dark puddle below with a dull splash. She paused for a heartbeat, looking down at the glowing screen in the mud. Then she remembered the ledger. The numbers are the only thing not lying. If she left the phone, they would track the GPS. They would think she was hiding in the trash heaps of the alley. She left it behind, a glowing beacon of misinformation, and dropped down onto the other side of the fence. The streets were deserted, the yellow glow of the lamps reflecting off the slick asphalt like oil on water. Sarah stayed in the shadows, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She needed help, but the world felt like it had been rewritten by Arthur's hand. Every shadow was a threat. Every distant siren was a funeral dirge. A pair of headlights crested the hill, sweeping across the brick walls. A white and black patrol car. Relief, sharp and desperate, surged through her. She stepped out from the shadows, waving her arms, her voice hoarse from the steam and the screaming. "Help! Please, stop!" The car slowed, the tires hissing against the wet road. It pulled to the curb, the rain blurring the silhouette of the driver. Sarah ran toward the window, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I need to report a murder, a conspiracy. My name is Sarah Sterling." The window rolled down with a slow, mechanical hum. The interior light flickered on. It wasn't a stranger. It was Miller. He leaned out, his scarred eyebrow raised, a predatory smile tugging at his lips. He didn't look like a police officer. He looked like a hunter who had just watched his prey walk into the snare. "Going somewhere, Sarah?" Miller asked, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. She recoiled, her heels skidding on the pavement. The patrol car wasn't a rescue. It was just another asset in the Sterling portfolio. She turned and ran, the sound of the car door opening behind her like the cocking of a gun. She dove into the narrow space between two brownstones, her shoulder clipping the brick, and kept moving. She had to get back to the estate. It was the last place they would expect her to go, and it was the only place where she had a chance. Her passport, her emergency cash, and the physical evidence of the bankruptcy were all locked in the library. If the Sterling Empire was a house of cards, she needed the one card that would bring the whole thing down. The mansion was dark when she arrived, a Gothic tomb looming against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. She entered through the servants' entrance, the smell of industrial bleach hitting her. A sterile, sharp scent that tried to scrub away the history of the house. She moved through the foyer, her footsteps silent on the marble. The air was unnaturally still, the temperature a calculated 68 degrees. She reached the library door, her hand on the cold brass knob, when a sound made her freeze. A rhythmic, percussive pop-pop-pop. The sound of knuckles cracking in a specific thumb-to-pinky sequence. In the shadows of the hallway, a figure detached itself from the darkness. He was thin, wired with tension, his eyes as dead as the screen of a broken monitor. This was the forensic cleaner from the Ledger, David Scott. He didn't carry a gun. He carried a length of piano wire that glinted in the faint light of the security monitors. "You're a difficult line item to close, Miss Sterling," Scott said, his voice a dry whisper. Sarah backed into the library, her mind racing. She was outmatched, outmuscled, and out of time. But she knew this house better than anyone. She knew the math of its security. She reached for the panel beside the door and punched in a code she had memorized years ago, the emergency strobe test for the burglar alarm. Suddenly, the room was obliterated by light. High-intensity white flashes pulsed at a frequency designed to disorient and nauseate. Flash, dark, flash, dark, asterisk. The world became a series of disconnected still frames. She saw Scott stumble, his hands flying to his eyes, the piano wire dropping to the rug. Sarah lunged. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the weight of the Sterling legacy. She grabbed a heavy bronze statue of a blindfolded justice from the side table and swung with every ounce of her rage. The metal connected with the side of Scott's head with a heavy, wet thud. He collapsed into the shadows, the strobe light still dancing over his prone form. She scrambled toward the bookshelves, her fingers dancing over the leather spines. She found it, the hollowed-out copy of Wealth of Nations. Inside wasn't a flask or gun. It was a physical ledger, handwritten in her father's cramped, obsessive script. She flipped the pages, her eyes scanning the columns. It wasn't just a record of crimes. It was a record of failure. The Sterling Empire wasn't a titan. It was a hollow shell. The murders hadn't been for expansion. They had been desperate attempts to trigger life insurance policies to cover Julian's billion-dollar gambling debts in Macau. The family was bankrupt. The firm was nothing but a series of corpses used to pay off the interest on a debt that could never be settled. "It's all gone," she whispered, the paper rustling in her shaking hands. It was all for nothing. The sound of a heavy footfall echoed from the hallway. Not the rhythmic counting of Julian, but the heavy, measured tread of a man with an axe. "Sarah." Julian's voice was no longer smooth. It was a jagged, animal howl. Give me the book, Sarah. It's mine. The legacy is mine. She bolted for the back of the library, hitting the hidden switch that opened the panic room. The steel door slid shut just as the first blow of the fire axe bit into the mahogany, the wood splintering like bone. Inside the panic room, the air was thick and recycled, tasting of copper and old sweat. Sarah sat at the high-tech console, the monitors showing Julian's distorted face as he swung the axe again and again at the reinforced glass. "You can't hide in there forever," he screamed, his face turning a bruised purple. "I'll burn the whole house down with you in it." Sarah ignored him. She looked at the satellite uplink terminal, the one piece of hardware that didn't rely on the local, compromised grid. She plugged in the drive, her fingers flying across the keys. She found the contact for Thomas Mitchell, the federal prosecutor in Boston. Progress: 1%, 5%, 12%. The progress bar was a slow, agonizing crawl. On the monitor, she saw Julian smash through the outer layer of the glass. He was a man possessed, his expensive suit torn, his Rolex gone. He looked like the monster the Sterling name had always intended him to be. "Come on!" she hissed at the screen. "Move faster!" The glass shattered. Julian lunged into the room, his hands catching on the jagged edges. He didn't care about the blood. He only cared about the data. He tackled her, the chairs spinning wildly as they crashed into the console. They fought on the floor, a brutal, messy struggle. Julian's hands clamped around her throat, his thumbs digging into her windpipe. Sarah clawed at his face, her nails drawing deep red furrows through his skin. The smell of his sweat and the metallic tang of his blood filled her senses. "It's over," Julian roared, pinning her against the desk. "I'm the one who survives. I'm the one who wins." He reached for the power cord, his fingers inches from the kill switch. Sarah looked at the screen. 90%. 91%. With a final, desperate surge, she drove her knee into his groin. Julian doubled over, his grip loosening. She scrambled toward the keyboard, but before she could hit the final enter to verify the packet transfer, the world went black. The hum of the air filtration died. The monitors flickered and vanished. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, velvet weight that pressed against her eardrums. Julian laughed in the darkness, a wet, ragged sound. "Remote override, Sarah. I cut the main breaker from the hallway. The uplink is dead. You're dead. And the world will never know the difference." Sarah lay on the floor, the cold steel of the room chilling her bones. She could hear Julian moving toward her, the sound of a medical syringe being uncapped, a small plastic click. "I'll tell them the stress of the audit was too much," Julian whispered, his voice hovering just above her in the dark. "A tragic overdose, just like Leo. A clean exit for a messy life." Sarah felt the prick of the needle against her arm. But she wasn't thinking about the death. She was thinking about the math. She knew this room. She knew the systems. The fire suppression wasn't electric. It was a pressurized chemical circuit triggered by a heat-sensitive glass bulb. She reached out, her fingers searching the air until they found the small, protruding bulb on the wall. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her heel against the glass. Crack! A roar of high-pressure gas erupted, followed by a thick, suffocating flood of oxygen-depleting foam. The room turned into a white, swirling chaos. Julian screamed, the sound muffled as the foam filled his lungs and stung his eyes. Sarah held her breath, her memory of the room's layout a grid in her mind. 6 feet to the left, 3 feet forward. She found the hidden floor safe, her fingers finding the backup hard drive she had stashed there months ago as a contingency. She grabbed it and crawled toward the laundry chute, the white foam coating her like a shroud. She slid into the damp darkness of the basement, the smell of bleach and old stone greeting her. She burst through the service door into the gray light of dawn. Miller was waiting for her by the gate. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a badge. "About time, Sterling," he said, his voice flat. "I've been undercover in this hellhole for 3 years, waiting for someone to find that physical ledger. I couldn't get close to it without triggering the alarms. You were the only one who had the codes." The shock was a dull ache. The betrayal, the fear, the violence. It had all been a play, and she had been the lead actor without knowing the script. Miller took the drive from her hands, his touch professional and cold. "We have Julian. We have Pendergast. The Empire is officially in receivership," Miller said. Sarah sat in the back of the government SUV, watching the sunrise over the estate. The gold light hit the windows of the library, making the house look beautiful, almost peaceful. But she knew the truth now. The beauty was a mask for the rot. The perfection was a lie told in the language of math. She walked through the empty boardroom of the Sterling Empire one last time. The long mahogany table was dust-free, the chairs perfectly aligned. She placed the physical ledger in the center of the table, a small black book that outweighed the entire building. She didn't look at the portraits on the wall. She didn't check her watch. She walked out of the building and into the noise of the city, leaving the balance sheet behind. For the first time in her life, she wasn't counting the seconds. She was just living them. The Sterling ledger was closed. The total was 0. And Sarah Sterling was finally free.